If you've been watching the news, you'd know that Professor Sullivan of Harvard Law School has been fired from his role as a college dean looking after students in student accommodation or halls of residence, and fired because he is defence counsel or barrister, or what the Americans call an attorney, for Harvey Weinstein. This is despite the fact that he is the first African American dean in Harvard University's history and has a distinguished career in civil rights matters. He wasn't sacked by the law school, note, but by non-lawyers. It's very important to remember that. Lawyers are the ones who are most angry about what has happened to Professor Sullivan, and 52 of his colleagues have written in his defence. Why are they so angry, and why is there such a difference? Because even Harvey Weinstein is entitled to the presumption of innocence and a fair trial. We show the best of us by extending courtesy and dignity to the worst of us. As a friend of mine pointed out before I started this recording today, Israel made sure that Adolf Eichmann had a competent lawyer, and all the defendants at Nuremberg were provided with counsel. The presumption of innocence is kind of where we are. This will give you a bit of an idea of where I'm going to take this podcast over the next few months. I'm hoping at some point to turn it into video, but I'll be the first person to admit that I'm not actually that great at technology. So all of those of you who've come over from Sargon of Akkad, and I'm very grateful to him for introducing my books and ideas and writing to a new audience, you'll just have to get used to the fact that I am not him, and it's going to take a very long time, and possibly never, before I get to the point where I'm as good as he is. The stuff that I'm talking about, though, should be reasonably obvious to you from what I've said to Sargon. I'm interested in Roman law. It was the first civilization to develop the presumption of innocence. Later, the English also developed the presumption of innocence as a concept, and for a long time people thought that the English must have copied it off of the Romans. Obviously one civilization came a lot later than the other one, surely they copied. But now legal scholars have done a lot of research to show that, in fact, the presumption of innocence as part of the broader rule of law is actually something that the English came up with independently of the Romans. They developed it themselves. Only two societies did this. It's quite striking to see. So the themes of this channel are as follows. I'll be explaining legal concepts to the layman. I'll also be taking an abiding interest in ancient Rome. After all, I've written 2 novels set there. And consistent with what I've been talking about to Sargon, I'll also be talking about British politics, and very occasionally Australian politics as well, because I grew up there. In Kingdom of the Wicked, the books that I did one of my video chats with Sargon about, Linnaeus, a major character, actually quotes the Latin that first conceptualised in very clear terms for modern people the concept of the presumption of innocence. Linnaeus is a wealthy lawyer in the books. He's charming, debauched. He is a posh Roman after all. He thinks that he is entitled to the good things in life, which was very much an attitude of that civilization. He's also Yeshua ben Yusuf's defense counsel. Yeshua ben Yusuf, that name being how the name of Jesus would have been said in Aramaic, the language that was spoken in Judea in the 1st century AD. That isn't to say that Jewish people didn't speak Hebrew then, they certainly did, but the lingua franca of the region was a language called Aramaic, which is still spoken in parts of Syria, although it's a minority language. Linnaeus is very successful. He's marked out as a future senator for the Populares Party, Rome's version of the Whigs or Liberals. Now, this is the UK definition of liberal for American listeners. It means classical liberal. It doesn't mean progressive like it tends to mean in the United States. The great philosopher, legal scholar and economist who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, F.A. Hayek, became very, very angry with the way Americans took the word liberal and changed its meaning. And he didn't like the new word libertarian either, because libertarian and classical liberal tend to mean different things if you're coming at them in terms of political science. And especially if you're British, you look at libertarian and you think that's not at all like Margaret Thatcher, who's sort of the best known classical liberal prime minister of recent memory, and something that of course Theresa May definitely isn't. Theresa May is about as far from classical liberal as it's possible to get. She represents a different strain of conservatism. As they always say, the Conservative Party is a broad church. Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, is Linnaeus's closest friend in Kingdom of the Wicked. They went to law school together. They are, however, politically very different. Pilate and his wife Claudia are both optimates, the Roman version of the Tories or Conservatives. And once again, we're dealing with British definitions. So they want to conserve things, particularly institutions. Pilate doesn't care that non-citizens can't vote, for example, and that poor citizens' votes count for less than middle or upper-class citizens' votes. Linnaeus does care. So this is one of the reasons why the two men, they are friends, but they disagree politically, and they're on different sides of the political aisle. These characters all form part of a narrative that takes place in a Roman Empire that has seen an industrial revolution and the abolition of slavery. It has modern technology, although not exactly the same sort of modern technology as we do and with which we're familiar. And it certainly doesn't have modern morals. Yeshua ben Yusuf, the man on trial, has morals that are a bit closer to ours. He believes, for example, in the moral equality of persons. This is known as moral egalitarianism, and the pagan Romans didn't have it. They thought, because people aren't factually equal, that they couldn't be treated equally. We think, or at least used to think, and this point is important, that despite factual inequality, I mean, this is trivially true. Some people are better at sums, others are faster in the 50-yard dash. This is seriously trivially true. We think that people are morally equal, regardless of their differences. This principle is sometimes described as equality before the law, or the letters carved out in front of the Supreme Court of the United States, equal justice under law. The principle is under threat now, mainly from people who want factual equality to be true. This is sometimes called equality of outcomes. They want equal numbers of men and women in STEM, for example, or they want equal pay despite the fact that women have children and tend to have more broken work histories, and so on. Also in other areas, they want exactly the same number of African Caribbeans on the BBC as are in the population. They want exactly the same number of male and female firsts at Oxford and Cambridge. And some of them, the ones that are at least intellectually consistent, want the same number of men to go to university as women. Many more women go to university these days, particularly in Britain, and overwhelmingly they do much better at it. And it is starting now to translate into higher salaries for women, particularly before they have children, because they do better at university. And there's a fairly consistent straight line between being clever at university and certainly doing well in the professions and earning a good salary. The danger with making moral equality dependent on factual equality, when equality of outcomes proves impossible, and it will prove impossible simply because people are different across groups, then becomes much easier to argue that people who are factually unequal are also morally unequal. One of the ways I've addressed this in Kingdom of the Wicked, because you're dealing with a society that thought because people were factually unequal, they weren't morally equal. So one of the ways I deal with this is to get the most decent character in Kingdom of the Wicked, the Roman prosecutor Cornelius. He's the equivalent of a principal crown prosecutor, or I believe what the Americans call a district attorney. And he is prosecuting Yeshua ben Yusuf, but he is also constructed in the book as a very decent human being. And for some reason, one that a lot of women seem to find sexually attractive, because I've had a reasonably large number of letters written to me by ladies who quite fancy Cornelius and want to know who he's based on. And I have to point out, actually, no, he's completely made up. He came out of my head. And if you fancy him, that's interesting. But one of the lines I give him during a conversation with Yeshua ben Yusuf is, "But people aren't equal." And I give him that line because if I put it in the mouth of a less noble character, in Pilate's mouth or in Linnaeus's mouth, because Linnaeus is really quite debauched, he's the stereotypical posh Roman. If I gave it to somebody else, a lot of readers, I know this, I mean, people tend to take these kinds of things away from novels, would just think it was an example of that character being a bad person. I had to make sure the line came from an admirable person because it's actually what Romans believed. And I've had a few shocked expressions from people along the lines of, "But Cornelius is so decent, why does he believe that?" And my response is, he's a Roman man, he upholds Roman law, and his values are consistent with what Romans would consider a good person in their civilization. And good people in their civilization, with very, very few exceptions, did not believe in the moral equality of persons. Our belief in the moral equality of persons is also why Harvey Weinstein is entitled to the presumption of innocence, and why his barrister or attorney shouldn't have been sacked for representing him. We're better than that. We can be better than that.